In a bustling terminal at Los Angeles International Airport, an extraordinary drama is about to unfold, one that will challenge assumptions, upend reputations, and rattle the foundations of justice. The humdrum rush of boarding calls and rolling luggage hides a pivotal meeting of fates. A short-tempered pilot, already on edge from a day fraught with personal disasters, is moments away from committing an act that will change his life forever. Unaware that the woman he's about to disrespect is the city's newly appointed chief of police, he crosses a line from which there may be no return. Once he makes that fateful choice, the entire world will watch as his actions spiral into a life-altering storm, and no one involved will ever be the same. Harriet Matthews, recently appointed chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, was a figure of calm authority amid the relentless energy of the city. She had grown up in south-central Los Angeles, raised by a mother who worked long hours to provide for her and her younger sister. Determined to create meaningful change, Harriet excelled at the LAPD Academy and rose rapidly through the ranks, earning a reputation for fairness and genuine care for the community. When the department's leadership needed fresh vision, they turned to her as the ideal successor, yet even driven professionals need respite. Harriet welcomed the chance to attend a law enforcement conference in Honolulu, hoping to take a short break afterward. She planned every detail meticulously, intending to speak on a panel about bridging gaps between police and citizens. Although she carried tremendous responsibility on her shoulders, she also balanced motherhood, living with her teen daughter Nadia and her supportive mother Linda in a cozy Spanish-style bungalow off Sunset Boulevard. Meanwhile, on the other side of Los Angeles, Sebastian "Bastian" Crowley, a commercial pilot for Redwood Pacific Airlines, stared into a morning sky tinged with smog and frustration. 30-something, and once celebrated for his flawless flight record, he was fast approaching a breaking point. A mountain of family debts and the collapse of his long-term relationship left him scrambling to hold on to a slipping sense of stability. To the outside world, Bastian appeared confident in his crisp uniform, but beneath that veneer swirled anger and desperation. He had received warnings from his superiors about recent outbursts toward ground crew and late arrivals for scheduled flights. One more incident, and his entire career could crash around him. Fatefully, Harriet and Bastian would soon board the same flight. Harriet's day began smoothly enough. A subdued dawn ride to Los Angeles International Airport, coffee in hand, ready for a 5-hour journey. She dressed casually, wearing a light blazer and slacks, preferring to avoid the visibility of her uniform. Arriving at LAX well before her departure, she felt relieved to blend in with everyday passengers for once. Bastian arrived at the airport in a contrasting state of mind. He was agitated, struggling to suppress the anger simmering inside. He braced himself for the standard pre-flight checks and the typical bustle of a busy airline hub. Today, however, he learned his co-pilot had called in sick, forcing Redwood Pacific to locate a last-minute substitute. More obstacles, more reasons for him to seethe under his breath. What neither of them knew was that Harriet's flight to Honolulu had been lightly rescheduled due to an equipment change, causing an unexpected gate switch. Harriet didn't catch the automated text alert until she was already waiting at the original gate. By the time she realized the error, she rushed to gate 36B, breath catching in mild frustration. The flustered gate attendant, Travis, struggled to reassign seats for a plane packed with vacationers heading to Hawaii. Harriet took the inconvenience in stride, politely accepting a new seat 14C, then patiently stepping aside for others. Just a short distance away, Bastian marched through the terminal and slipped past the check-in line toward the jet bridge. All around him, families in floral shirts chattered excitedly about luau's and beach adventures. Their cheerful moods only amplified the tension gnawing at Bastian's nerves. He managed a brisk, curt nod to the gate staff, consumed with the preoccupied urgency that had become his trademark. Inside the plane, passengers were shuffled like puzzle pieces as the cabin crew tried to match seat requests to the ticketing changes. Harriet, originally assigned to sit near the front, graciously gave up her seat to a couple who insisted on sitting together. She moved down the aisle to 26B, a gesture of patience that hardly went unnoticed by onlookers tired of airline hassles. Meanwhile, Bastian strapped himself into the cockpit and glowered at the revised flight plan details. The weather reports out of Honolulu warned of building storms, potentially leading to a bumpy landing. A swirl of personal and professional stress was wearing his composure thin. Seated in row 26, Harriet breathed deeply to remain relaxed, reminding herself that once in Honolulu, she would focus on the conference and perhaps enjoy a brief sunset stroll on the beach. Little did she know how a single moment of conflict, fueled by one man's barely contained fury, would change the trajectory of her trip. Far from the glamorous illusions often associated with Los Angeles, two people on the brink, one a rising police chief, the other a once promising pilot, were about to converge in an encounter that would challenge everything they believed about power, respect, and justice. Bastian stepped into the cockpit to perform the standard pre-flight checks. The replacement co-pilot, Sophia Ramirez, was new to Redwood Pacific and looked a bit nervous. She politely greeted him, but Bastian's response was curt. He barely acknowledged her presence. He was too occupied with reviewing the last minute flight plan changes. The dispatch team indicated a possible thunderstorm near Honolulu in the later part of the day, which might lead to moderate turbulence during landing. The irregularities only added to his mounting stress. Meanwhile, Harriet finally obtained her boarding pass. Travis apologized for the confusion, explaining that the airline had to shuffle seats around to accommodate the large group traveling together. Harriet assured him it was fine, calmly accepted her new seat, number 14C, an aisle seat in the main cabin, and thanked him for his help. As she walked toward the airplane door, she noticed how the gate area was swarming with families, all of them wearing floral leis and brimming with excitement about Hawaii. Their happiness was contagious, and Harriet allowed herself a moment to smile. That moment of calm, however, was short-lived. Stepping into the jet bridge, she overheard raised voices coming from near the plane's entrance. A couple was arguing with a flight attendant, complaining about seats not being together. The husband, in frustration, mentioned he'd paid extra money on Redwood Pacific's website to ensure they could sit side by side. The flight attendant, looking weary, explained the seats had been reassigned due to an equipment change on the aircraft. Harriet, holding her own ticket, empathized. It seemed disorganization reigned on this flight. Inside the cockpit, Bastian gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. Another flight attendant, a junior staffer named Darrell, poked his head into the cockpit. Captain Crowley?" he said. "We have some passenger seating issues, and they insist they paid for seat selection. We're a bit overbooked." Without turning around, Bastian muttered, "Tell them to sit wherever they want if seats are empty, or deal with it in flight. I'm not stepping out there." Sophia glanced at Bastian, slightly taken aback by his dismissive tone. She wanted to suggest a calmer approach, but Bastian's body language screamed that he was in no mood to be corrected or questioned. She decided to focus on her own tasks, double-checking the fuel load, verifying the weight and balance data. A few rows back, Harriet noticed the same couple still in heated discussion with Darrell. She quietly offered her seat if it would help. The couple looked surprised at her generosity, but Harriet insisted, "It's no trouble. I'm traveling alone, so I can sit wherever they have room." Darrell found Harriet another seat, 26B, in the middle of the plane. Harriet carried her small shoulder bag back down the aisle, weaving through the families stowing their carry-ons. She felt a pang of yearning for her own family. She reminded herself that she was doing this trip to be a better leader, to learn from the conference and to catch a breath of fresh air in Hawaii. All the while, the tension in the cabin thickened. Some passengers were exasperated at the seat mix-ups. Others were upset by the crowded overhead bins. A baby started wailing somewhere in the back. Two young men debated whether they should have flown out of John F. Kennedy International Airport instead, complaining that LA's local Redwood Pacific hub was always chaotic. In the flight deck, Bastian slammed a compartment shut. He was starting to perspire, despite the cockpit's cool air. He forced himself to run through the mental checklist: flaps, spoilers, fuel pumps, hydraulic systems, radio checks. Each click of a switch echoed in his mind. Finally, the cabin door closed. Bastian donned his headset and prepared for pushback. As the plane taxied, Harriet settled into her new seat, took a deep breath. She tried to shake off the small frustrations, focusing instead on the speech she'd deliver at the conference. With any luck, the flight would be uneventful, and she'd be sipping a tropical fruit drink in Honolulu by late afternoon. Fate, however, had other plans. The seeds of conflict from that morning's chaos were about to sprout into something far more explosive. Two determined personalities, one racked by pent-up anger, the other guided by a deep sense of justice, were on a collision course. The plane's wheels might leave the ground, but the real turbulence was waiting inside. An hour into the flight, the seatbelt sign was switched off. Passengers relaxed, some drifting off to sleep, others scrolling through their phones or flipping through in-flight magazines. Flight attendants started beverage service, offering water, sodas, coffee, and small snack boxes. Harriet graciously declined the snack, choosing instead to pull out her tablet and review her notes. The conference in Honolulu would feature prominent chiefs from all over the United States. Her focus would be on a recent LAPD initiative that reduced community complaints by 25% through systematic empathy training and accountability procedures. Up in the cockpit, Bastian was still on edge. He and Sophia exchanged minimal words. The plane cruised at 34,000 feet, steady for the time being. Then the weather reports from Honolulu started to come in. The storm was building quicker than expected, and air traffic control warned them of changing approach patterns. That meant they might have to circle for some time or land on a different runway. Another complication. Bastian grumbled a series of curses under his breath. Sophia tried to gently inquire if he needed any assistance with the radio calls, but he snapped at her. "Just do your job," he hissed. Sophia, shocked, backed off. The day had begun with tension, and it was rapidly accelerating toward a breaking point. In row 26, Harriet's tranquility broke when she heard commotion from a few rows in front of her. A passenger was angrily demanding more than one small bag of pretzels, arguing that Redwood Pacific had promised complimentary snacks. Flight attendant Darrell attempted to calm the passenger. Harriet considered intervening but decided it wasn't her place. She was off duty, and this was standard in flight friction. Still, she watched, alert to the potential for escalation. A moment later, a child across the aisle accidentally spilled orange juice on Harriet's seat. The mother apologized profusely. Harriet calmly reassured her, using some napkins to dab away the spill. The mother seemed relieved, grateful that Harriet wasn't making a scene. Suddenly, the seatbelt sign dinged on, and the pilot's voice crackled through the overhead speaker. Bastian's tone was clipped, almost confrontational. "Folks, we've turned on the seatbelt sign due to potential turbulence ahead. Please return to your seats immediately." The abruptness of his announcement took some passengers aback. Harriet's instincts as a law enforcement professional perked up. She sensed that something was off in his tone, but she couldn't quite place it. Then came the turbulence. The plane jolted once, then twice, more sharply. Flight attendants had to suspend the beverage service. Passengers braced themselves. Harriet tucked her tablet into the seat pocket, making sure it was secure. The child next to her clung to his mother's arm. The mother looked terrified, so Harriet offered a few calming words, reminding her that air travel was statistically safe and that most turbulence, while scary, is harmless. After about 10 minutes, the turbulence eased. The seatbelt sign remained on, but several passengers got up anyway to use the lavatory. Among them was a tall man who seemed restless, ignoring the flight attendant's directive to remain seated. A male flight attendant repeated that he should sit down for his own safety, but the passenger insisted he couldn't wait any longer. The situation was tense, but not uncommon. Bastien, however, was in no mood to tolerate any perceived disobedience. He barked at Daryl over the intercom in the flight attendant's station to force the passenger to sit down. The flight attendant tried to intervene gently, but the passenger snapped back. In the cockpit, Bastien unbuckled his harness, his anger reaching a boiling point. He left Sophia in control, storming out of the cockpit to handle the problem himself. Passengers gasped as the pilot, his face red with rage, marched down the aisle. He confronted the tall passenger near the forward lavatory. "You want to get everyone killed?" Bastien spat. "When the seatbelt sign is on, you stay in your seat." Taken aback, the passenger stuttered that it was an emergency. Bastien pointed a finger in his face. "Next time, hold it until I say you can move, or I'll have you arrested when we land." The passenger returned to his seat, thoroughly embarrassed and upset. Bastien whirled around, scanning the rows for any other signs of disobedience. The tension in the cabin was so thick you could slice it. People were whispering, eyes wide with shock. Harriet watched from her seat. She felt her heart rate spike. The pilot stepping out of the cockpit to berate a passenger was an extreme move, signifying a massive breach in protocol. She was about to stand and try to de-escalate when Bastien's gaze locked onto her. He noticed that she had unbuckled her seatbelt to help the mother with the spilled juice earlier. Though Harriet was now seated again, he marched over. "MAAM, the seatbelt sign is on. Is reading your phone more important than your safety?" Harriet's jaw set. She wasn't even looking at her phone, she'd put it away. In a calm but firm tone, she replied, "Sir, am seated. Belt on." "There's no need for that attitude." Bastien loomed over her, eyes flickering with the pent-up rage from his personal life and the day's mounting pressures. "You want to tell me how to run my plane?" he snarled. Passengers watched, horrified. Harriet held his glare, well aware of how to handle a hostile confrontation without escalating. She used her training, remain calm, use a measured tone. "No, Captain, I do not. I only ask that you show respect while you're on duty." At that moment, something in Bastien snapped. Maybe it was the stress of the storms, the threatened eviction, the strain of his brother's debts. Whatever the reason, he lost control. Without warning, he raised his hand and struck Harriet across the face. The slap echoed in the stunned silence, reverberating through the cabin. Gasps and cries filled the air. A child screamed. The flight attendants froze in place, wide-eyed with shock. Harriet instinctively brought a hand to her stinging cheek. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The pilot of the aircraft, in the middle of a flight, had just physically assaulted her. Fury flared inside her, but she kept her composure. "Sir," she said slowly, her voice trembling with both anger and shock, "I need you to step back." Bastien, breathing heavily, realized too late what he'd done. The moment his hand made contact, the full weight of that action started to sink in, yet his pride and aggression wouldn't let him apologize. He stood there, chest heaving, as Harriet rose from her seat. She fixed him with a look that could shatter mountains. One of the flight attendants, Daryl, finally found his voice. "Captain, you hit a passenger." All color drained from Bastien's face as the first wave of consequences crashed into his mind. Then Harriet spoke clearly. "You just assaulted me." And you have no idea who I am. The air in the cabin felt impossibly dense. Passengers craned their necks to see the drama unfolding between the enraged pilot and the dignified woman he had just struck. The child across the aisle whimpered, clutching his mother's arm. Several people had pulled out their phones, recording the incident. Harriet lowered her trembling hand from her cheek. She could already feel the skin throbbing. Every instinct screamed at her to arrest him right there, but the fact remained they were on a plane, cruising at 34,000 feet. She took a measured breath and forced herself to remain calm. "Sir," she said firmly, "you have committed battery against a passenger." Bastian's eyes flickered with a cocktail of anger, confusion, and panic. "You don't tell me," he began, but Harriet cut him off. Her voice was low, dangerous. "I'm the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged stunned glances. A few recognized her name, recalling news reports. Others might not have known her identity, but hearing chief of the LAPD from the woman the pilot had just slapped was enough to make jaws drop. Bastian looked like a man who'd been punched in the gut. His bravado wavered, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down. That can't be true," he stammered. "Why would the chief of police be on my plane in economy class?" Harriet squared her shoulders. "I'm on official business to Honolulu for a law enforcement conference. Now, Captain, step away from me and return to the cockpit before you make this worse than it already is." Her voice carried the authority of decades in law enforcement. Suddenly, Flight Attendant Darrell stepped between them, arms outstretched as though warding off further violence. Sophia, the co-pilot, emerged from the cockpit, looking panicked. She'd felt the plane dip slightly without Bastian at the controls, so she re-engaged autopilot and rushed out. Upon seeing the chaos, her eyes darted from Harriet to Bastian. "Captain Crowley?" she asked in a shaky voice. "What in the world is going on?" Several passengers began shouting, "He hit her! He slapped that lady! She's lapdee!" Bastian pressed both hands to his temples, as if trying to stop an impending migraine. He had no words, no defense. His eyes locked on Harriet, who matched his gaze with quiet, simmering outrage. She could feel the sting and warmth on her cheek intensify, but her discipline told her to remain composed. On instinct, Harriet reached for her phone. Her first thought was to call for backup. Then she remembered they were mid-flight. No signal. She glanced at the rows of wide-eyed passengers, at the flight attendants, and at Bastian. Finally, she said, "Sophia, is it? You're the co-pilot?" "Yes," Sophia answered, voice shaking. "Take your pilot back to the cockpit," Harriet ordered. "Land this plane as soon as possible. I want him in custody once we're on the ground." Bastian bristled, but he was clearly at a loss. His anger had erupted. Now all that remained was the horrifying realization of what he'd done. Sophia nodded, placing a gentle hand on Bastian's arm. "Captain, please," she murmured. Bastian shook her off, but after a moment of staring Harriet down, he turned around and stomped forward. Passengers began murmuring in disbelief at how quickly everything had escalated. Harriet could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you get that on video? I can't believe the pilot actually slapped her. She's the chief of police. He is so done." Harriet took a deep, steadying breath. She made a mental note. She had the legal authority to place him under arrest, but that would involve subduing him physically if he resisted, and he was still responsible for piloting the aircraft. She recognized the potential danger if Bastian tried to sabotage the flight. But for now, the best course of action was to let the co-pilot assume the majority of the flight duties and get the plane on the ground safely. Darrell and the other flight attendants rushed to Harriet, asking if she needed medical attention. Harriet shook her head. "I'll be fine. But you need to contact air traffic control. Advise them we have an emergency situation on board. Request immediate priority to land." Sophia overheard Harriet and began nodding. "We'll need to divert," she said. "The storm in Honolulu might complicate that. I'll check with air traffic control and see if we can land on an outer island or turn back to LAX." Harriet spoke calmly but firmly. "Do whatever you have to do. I'll cooperate fully. But that man is not landing this plane." Sophia's eyes widened. She nodded. "I'll handle the approach and landing. I'll also make sure Redwood Pacific's operations center knows what's happening." Then she hurried back to the cockpit. By now, every single passenger was fully aware that something unprecedented was taking place. Some clutched their phones, others clung to loved ones, and still others sat in stunned silence, casting fearful glances toward the front of the plane. Harriet sank back into her seat, the reality settling over her. She'd just been slapped by a pilot, no less, and she had identified herself as the chief of the LAPD in the middle of a flight. This was going to make headlines. Her stomach churned at the thought of the media frenzy, but more importantly, she was concerned for everyone's safety. Would Bastien lose control again? Could he try something else? The flight attendants offered Harriet an ice pack for her cheek, and she gratefully accepted. With each passing minute, the tension in the cabin only grew. She could almost feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some offering silent support, others simply gawking at the spectacle. One thing was certain. For Sebastian Crowley, there would be no easy escape from the consequences of that moment. And for Harriet, the next few hours would be a test of her composure, her leadership, and her commitment to the very principles she'd spent her life defending. Back in the cockpit, Sophia slid into the pilot's seat. Bastien hovered behind her, arms folded, sweat beading on his forehead. His mind raced with the gravity of his situation. Assaulting a passenger was bad enough. Striking the chief of the LAPD seemed catastrophic beyond belief. He stared at the flight instrument panel, eyes darting as though searching for an escape route. But there was none. They were in the air, miles from land. Sophia took a deep breath. She pressed down on the radio switch. "Mayday, Mayday, Redwood Pacific, 212, declaring an onboard emergency due to incapacitation of the pilot." She hesitated, glancing at Bastien. "We have a flight deck disturbance. I, co-pilot Sophia Ramirez, am taking over. Request immediate landing clearance." Traffic control responded with tense urgency. They confirmed Redwood Pacific 212's identity and asked for details. Sophia explained that the captain was no longer fit to fly and that they might require law enforcement to meet them on the ground. The air traffic controller's tone grew serious, verifying if the plane was still safe, if they needed to divert, and if the pilot was physically threatening anyone. Bastien's face flushed with resentment. Sophia's report to ATC was an irrevocable step. There would be official documentation that he was incapacitated in flight. That alone could result in the revocation of his license. Any illusions of escaping this incident with minimal damage evaporated. Nevertheless, he remained silent. He knew that interfering with the flight at this point could be considered an act of aviation sabotage, likely landing him in federal prison. He decided to remain in the cockpit, praying for some kind of miracle or a way to salvage his career, his life. Harriet, still in row 26, managed to keep her composure. She occasionally felt the bruise forming on her cheek with her fingertips, wincing slightly at the tenderness. Around her, passengers whispered in hushed tones, trying to piece together the scene they'd just witnessed. Some looked at her with admiration and concern. Others were shaking with anxiety, worried about their safety. The flight attendants were unsure how to proceed. They hovered near Harriet, explaining that the co-pilot was negotiating an emergency landing. Harriet requested to speak with Redwood Pacific's operations center if possible, wanting to ensure that law enforcement on the ground would be prepared for a serious assault case. One attendant promised to relay her request. 15 minutes later, the overhead speaker crackled again, Sophia's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We will be making an unscheduled landing at Hilo International Airport on the island of Hawaii. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the cabin crew. We apologize for the inconvenience, but your safety is our top priority. The plane started a wide turn, gradually descending. Although the turbulence was mild, the atmosphere inside the cabin was thick with tension. Harriet's training kicked in. She assessed the potential risks of Bastien losing control or any other passenger panicking. She mentally formulated a plan to subdue him if necessary, though she prayed it wouldn't come to that. As the plane descended through a layer of clouds, the tension increased. Bastien remained in the cockpit, a silent statue behind Sophia, watching as she expertly guided the plane. Harriet closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer that the landing would be smooth and the situation wouldn't escalate further. At last, the runway lights came into view. Hilo's airport was smaller than Honolulu's bustling terminals, but it had sufficient emergency services for such an incident. The landing gear deployed, and Harriet felt the slight lurch as the aircraft aligned with the runway. A few passengers applauded, though it was more a collective sigh of relief when the wheels made contact with the tarmac and the plane slowed down without incident. Sophia taxied to a remote gate where airport security vehicles waited, lights flashing. Paramedics and the local police formed a perimeter, anticipating a high-priority situation. Harriet unbuckled her seatbelt and grabbed her bag, steeling herself for what was about to happen. She was both a victim in this case and the highest-ranking law enforcement officer on board. Protocol demanded she allow the local authorities to handle the arrest. She intended to comply fully, not wanting to overshadow their jurisdiction, but she also needed to ensure that justice was served. As soon as the seatbelt sign went off, Harriet stood and moved toward the front. Passengers parted for her like the Red Sea. Some touched her arm, whispering words of support. She acknowledged them with nods of gratitude. Her cheek ached, and beneath the calm exterior, she was angry, furious that a man in a position of such responsibility and trust had let his rage overcome him. Furious that he had jeopardized the safety of everyone on this aircraft. At the front, the door opened to reveal a small collection of uniformed officers from the Hawaii County Police Department. Their faces registered surprise when Harriet introduced herself as the chief of the LAPD. One officer, a rangy man named Sergeant Kai Lehua, took her statement right there in the galley, scribbling notes on a pad. Harriet recounted the assault and explained that the pilot had physically struck her without provocation. Sophia stepped off the plane first, ushering Bastien forward. Two officers approached him cautiously. "Captain Sebastian Crowley?" Sergeant Lehua asked. Bastien glared, but his shoulders sagged in defeat. He gave no resistance as they patted him down and placed him in handcuffs. Someone read him his Miranda rights. In a matter of minutes, Sebastian Crowley, once a respected pilot, was led down the steps onto the tarmac. Looking haggard and dazed, cameras flashed. Word had traveled fast within the airport that Redwood Pacific 212 was making an emergency landing due to the pilot's alleged assault on a passenger. Harriet gave a brief statement to a Redwood Pacific representative who had rushed onto the scene, clarifying that she would cooperate with any internal investigation as well. She insisted the flight attendants be commended for their quick action in helping her, and the other passengers remain calm. Behind her, some of those very passengers were disembarking, gazing at Harriet with respect and no small amount of awe. With Bastien in custody, Harriet finally felt her tension give way to a shaky sort of relief. She was safe, the other passengers were safe, but a new saga was about to begin, one that would unfold in the days and weeks to come, in the media, in courtrooms, and in the eyes of the public. The pilot had assaulted not just any passenger, but the chief of the LAPD. The karmic backlash was only beginning. Within hours, news of the incident went viral. Passengers on Redwood Pacific 212 who had recorded the slap promptly uploaded the footage to social media, where it spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #PilotSlap, #AirlineAssault, and #Chief Harriet Matthews trended across platforms. National news outlets scrambled for more details. Cable news programs ran breaking news segments on the outrageous assault of an LAPD chief mid-flight. In a modest terminal lounge at Hilo International Airport, Harriet found herself temporarily sequestered. The Hawaii County Police Department wanted to secure her statement away from the press. She sat on a cushioned bench, surrounded by officers who treated her with respectful deference. She gave them a thorough account of events, from boarding the plane to the slap that would likely define this pilot's downfall. Sergeant Kai Lehua shook his head in disbelief. "I've heard of air rage from passengers, but never from a pilot attacking someone, especially not a police chief." Harriet offered a polite nod. "I wish I were making it up. It was surreal." "You want to press charges, Chief?" asked the sergeant. "Yes," Harriet replied, her voice firm. "That man is a danger to the public." Meanwhile, Redwood Pacific Airlines was in crisis management mode. The CEO, Caitlin Zhang, had flown to Hilo to manage the fallout personally. While Harriet continued her conversation with the Hawaii County Police, Zhang approached, flanked by corporate attorneys. The tension in the lounge escalated. Zhang apologized profusely, offering immediate medical assistance and any resources Harriet might need. Harriet, holding an ice pack to her cheek, responded coolly, "I appreciate your concern, Miss Zhang. Right now, my priority is ensuring Captain Crowley faces the full consequences of his actions." Zhang looked genuinely mortified. "Rest assured, Redwood Pacific will fully cooperate with law enforcement. We will also launch our own internal investigation." She paused, scanning Harriet's expression for any sign of leniency. Finding none, she sighed. "We understand the severity of this." Harriet gave a slight nod, then turned her attention back to Sergeant Lehua. Zhang and her team left to brief Redwood Pacific's public relations department. The press was outside, cameras and microphones poised to pounce on any official statement. Elsewhere, Bastian sat in a holding cell at the local station, staring blankly at the wall. The adrenaline rush had faded, leaving only the cold realization that he had destroyed his life in a single impulsive act. He'd lost not just his job, but possibly his freedom. Assaulting anyone was a serious offense. Assaulting the chief of the LAPD was an entirely different level of disaster. Federal charges could be brought against him for interfering with a flight. Visions of a lengthy prison sentence loomed. He thought about his father, once a proud officer in a small-town sheriff's department, who had dreamed that his son would lead a stable, honorable life. He remembered the day he'd earned his pilot's wings, how his father's eyes had welled with tears of pride. Now that dream was in shambles. Bastian's entire identity had come crashing down with that single slap. At LAX, reporters besieged Redwood Pacific's main office. Other pilots and airline staff watched the shocking footage online, horrified by their colleagues' actions. Some recognized that Bastian had been under pressure, but none could defend his violent outburst. Back in Los Angeles, Harriet's daughter, Nadia, was at home watching the breaking news. She was stunned to see her mother's face on the screen, learning that she had been assaulted mid-flight. Linda, Harriet's mother, tried to call Harriet, but the call went straight to voicemail. Fear knotted in Nadia's stomach. She felt both outrage and concern. The images replayed on the television, a pilot raising his hand, the blurry impact, Harriet's stoic reaction. In the days to come, Harriet would have to navigate a sea of interviews, depositions, and public statements, all while processing the personal violation she experienced. People in her community looked to her as a symbol of strength and justice. In private moments, She felt the sting not just on her cheek, but in her heart, knowing that while she was physically unhurt, the emotional toll was significant. The event served as a stark reminder that no title or rank could ever completely shield her from harm. For Bastien, each hour behind bars brought deeper regret. He wondered if Harriet would show him any mercy, but mercy was not Harriet's immediate priority. Accountability was. Before Harriet left Hilo for Honolulu, this time on a different flight, and escorted by Redwood Pacific staff, who treated her like royalty, she held a brief press conference at the local police station. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. She emphasized that no one, regardless of position, was above the law. She also praised the quick thinking of the flight attendants and co-pilot Sofia Ramirez for prioritizing passenger safety. The press conference solidified Harriet's public image as an unflappable leader, but behind her measured tone was a swirl of conflicting emotions. She was outraged and exhausted. A part of her wanted to push the memory away, yet she couldn't ignore her responsibility to see this case through. As Harriet boarded her new flight to Honolulu, she was greeted by an apologetic crew who recognized her immediately. One flight attendant offered her a fresh lie, a small courtesy to welcome her to the islands under far better circumstances. Harriet thanked the attendant with a small, genuine smile. She set her carry-on in the overhead bin and sank into her seat, closing her eyes. In the background, she could still hear the echoes of that fateful slap. She knew she would have to relive it many times as she gave statements to investigators and faced media scrutiny. Yet she remained resolute. The pilot would face justice, and she would continue to uphold the values that had guided her entire career. A week later, Harriet sat in her office at LAPD headquarters, a sleek glass-walled space overlooking the bustle of downtown Los Angeles. She had successfully delivered her conference address in Honolulu, though the assault overshadowed every other event and returned to the city she served. In her absence, the department had functioned smoothly, but Harriet's staff sensed a shift. Their chief was now at the center of a high-profile case that had captured national attention. Piles of paperwork sat on Harriet's desk, largely overshadowed by legal documents related to the Redwood Pacific incident. The Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) had launched an investigation into Captain Sebastian Crowley's actions. Harriet had given multiple interviews to authorities, describing his aggressive behavior and the events leading up to the assault. She learned from Redwood Pacific's internal memos, leaked to the press, that Bastien had prior incidents of anger management issues, though never physical violence of this magnitude. Things took an unexpected turn when Harriet received a call from an unlikely source. Bastien's lawyer, a tenacious defense attorney named Grace Tan. Grace politely requested a meeting, stating that Bastien wanted to apologize in person, and also that they were exploring a plea deal. Harriet felt a mixture of curiosity and revulsion. She didn't relish the idea of seeing the man who'd struck her again, but as a law enforcement officer, she believed in due process. She agreed to meet in a neutral setting, the courthouse conference room, rather than her office. On the appointed day, Harriet arrived in her official uniform, accompanied by an LAPD legal counsel. To her surprise, Bastien was already there, looking haggard in a cheap suit that hung off his shoulders. He stood up the moment Harriet walked in, something like shame flitting across his features. Grace Tan introduced herself, shaking hands with Harriet and the LAPD attorney. Then she gestured for Bastien to speak. He swallowed hard. In a low voice he said, "Chief Matthews, I'm truly sorry for what I did. I lost control." His eyes flicked to Harriet's bruise, which was faint but still visible. He looked away, pained. "You didn't deserve that. No one does." Harriet studied him. The raw remorse in his eyes seemed genuine, but she'd encountered manipulative criminals before who could fake contrition. She said nothing, waiting. Grace Tan cleared her throat. Captain Crowley is prepared to plead guilty to charges of misdemeanor battery and also surrender his pilot's license voluntarily. He is hoping for leniency on the federal charge of interference with a flight crew, which could carry a long prison sentence. Bastian spoke again, voice trembling. "I know I ruined everything. My life was a mess, and I snapped. I'm not asking for you to forgive me. I just want you to know I accept responsibility. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Harriet maintained her composure. "You endangered a plane full of people," she said quietly. "You abused your authority as a pilot. This isn't just about me. There were children on that flight, entire families. Do you understand that?" Bastian nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. "I know," he whispered, voice muffled. "I can't undo it, but I wish I could." A tense silence followed. Harriet's attorney leaned over, whispering legal jargon about recommended sentences and the possibility of probation. Harriet listened, her mind whirling. She believed in second chances, but also believed that actions must have consequences. She spoke clearly. "This is for the courts to decide. But understand, Captain Crowley, I will give my complete testimony. I won't hold back. Whatever the judge decides, I expect you to abide by it." Bastian nodded, tears now rolling down his cheeks. The tension in the room was palpable. Harriet's own heart pounded. Part of her empathized. Everyone struggles with personal demons, but she also recalled the sting of his palm against her face, the shocking moment he abused his power in the middle of that flight. Grace Tan respectfully thanked Harriet for hearing them out. "We're prepared to recommend anger management programs, therapy, community service, whatever the court deems necessary. We just wanted you to know we aren't going to drag this into a lengthy trial." Harriet left the courthouse with conflicting emotions. Bastian's apology, though possibly sincere, didn't erase the harm. Still, Harriet recognized that locking him away for years might not serve the broader good, unless he refused to accept accountability. She would cooperate with the process, trusting the justice system she had spent her life upholding. The twists continued a few days later when Redwood Pacific announced a sweeping review of their pilot screening and mental health support programs. They publicly apologized to Harriet and the passengers of Flight 212. The CEO held a press conference, vowing to prevent such incidents in the future. "This is an isolated but shocking case," Caitlin Zhang stated. "We're taking steps to ensure no pilot under immense personal stress goes unnoticed or unsupported." The public reaction was mixed. Some praised Harriet's composure and Redwood Pacific's swift response. Others criticized the airline for not catching Bastian's issues sooner or demanded stricter punishment for him. Through it all, Harriet continued her duties as chief. She met with community leaders, oversaw departmental reforms, and comforted her daughter, who still shuddered at the thought of what could have happened on that flight. Underneath her polished exterior, Harriet grappled with a blend of anger, relief, and a strange sympathy for a pilot whose life had derailed so spectacularly. But the final reckoning remained on the horizon. Bastian's sentencing hearing. Harriet knew the courtroom would be packed, cameras rolling, the public hungry for closure. And she would be there, testifying to the truth of that terrifying moment in the sky. A month later, the corridors of the Los Angeles County Courthouse bustled with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all eager to witness the climax of the Redwood Pacific assault case. Camera crews lined the steps, jostling for position and shouting questions at anyone remotely connected to the incident. Harriet arrived with a small entourage, her attorney, a few close officers from her staff, and her mother, Linda, who insisted on offering moral support. The tension thickened as they made their way to the courtroom, passing Bastian's defense team in the hallway. Grace Tan greeted them with a polite nod, though Bastien was nowhere in sight, likely waiting in a holding room. Inside, rows of pew-like benches were packed. Members of the public sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering about the pilot who slapped the police chief. Harriet felt a swirl of emotions. She spotted some faces from Redwood Pacific, flight attendants Darrell and others who had been on Flight 212, the co-pilot Sophia Ramirez, and even the airline's CEO, Caitlin Zhang, discreetly seated at the back. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise." The Honourable Judge Elaine Morrison took the bench. She was known for her no-nonsense demeanour and fair but firm rulings. Everyone sat, and moments later, Bastien was escorted in, hands clasped before him. He wore a modest suit, face drawn, eyes sunken. Harriet observed him calmly, remembering the rage that had contorted his features on that flight. The hearing began. Prosecutors recounted the events in stark detail, a pilot under extreme stress, leaving the cockpit mid-flight, physically assaulting a passenger who happened to be the chief of the LAPD. Video evidence was played on a large screen. The slap reverberated through the hushed courtroom. Harriet couldn't help but wince, the memory still raw. Then came Harriet's turn to testify. She rose, standing tall in her neatly pressed police uniform. The prosecutor led her through the series of events that day, her seat reassignment, the turbulence, the pilot's outburst, the slap that left her cheek bruised and her sense of security rattled. She spoke calmly, methodically, never exaggerating. Her tone was resolute. Cameras captured every nuance of her expression, broadcasting her testimony on the evening news. Grace Tan cross-examined Harriet, careful not to seem overly aggressive. She asked whether Harriet believed Bastien was in a compromised mental state. Harriet replied, "I'm not a mental health professional, ma'am. What I know is that he lost control and struck me, endangering everyone on board." When Harriet finished, the prosecution rested, satisfied they had made a clear case. Next, Grace Tan presented Bastien's defense. She read from psychological evaluations that indicated Bastien suffered from severe anxiety, depression, and crippling financial stress. A mental health professional testified that Bastien's impulse control had been compromised by a confluence of personal crises. It was a plea for understanding, if not exoneration. Finally, Bastien himself took the stand. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He spoke in a halting voice, describing his upbringing, his once promising career, and the slow crumble of his life under unmanageable burdens. "I'm not making excuses," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "I take full responsibility for what I did. There's no justification for striking another person, especially someone who trusted me as her pilot." At one point, Bastien turned to Harriet, voice catching. "Chief Matthews, I want to apologize to you personally. I betrayed the trust of everyone on that plane and the entire aviation community. I have no one to blame but myself." The courtroom fell silent. Harriet met his gaze, her face solemn. She offered no smile, but nodded slightly, a gesture that acknowledged his words, though it did not absolve him. After closing arguments, Judge Morrison announced she needed time to deliberate. The court recessed for an hour. Harriet waited in the hallway, fielding questions from reporters until court personnel ushered them away. She exchanged a few quiet words with Sophia Ramirez, who had also testified. Sophia was relieved the ordeal was nearly over, but remained shaken by the memory of a catastrophic breakdown in the cockpit. When everyone reconvened, Judge Morrison delivered her verdict and sentencing. Bastien was found guilty of misdemeanor battery and interference with a flight crew under special circumstances. She handed down a sentence of 18 months in county jail, with mandatory completion of an intensive anger management program and indefinite revocation of his pilot's license. The judge also imposed community service hours, requiring Bastien to speak publicly about the dangers of unmanaged stress and aggression in high-stakes professions. Harriet exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She felt a wave of relief. The sentence was not overly harsh. Some had predicted years in federal prison, but it was firm enough to affirm that his behavior was intolerable. The judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. This court recognizes the defendant's remorse and mental health challenges, but it also recognizes the grave nature of his offense. Safety in the skies is paramount. Bastien bowed his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. The bailiff led him away in handcuffs. The cameras clicked and whirred, capturing every moment. Harriet watched with a stoic expression, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and empathy. He had brought this upon himself, but she couldn't help but see the broken man behind the monstrous act. In a swirl of media questions, Harriet left the courtroom. The sentence was decided, and justice, however imperfect, had been served. Now she could begin the process of healing, and the city of Los Angeles would carry on, with Chief Harriet Matthews still at its helm, unwavering and resolute. Weeks turned into months. The public frenzy around the assault case gradually subsided, replaced by new headlines and daily concerns. Harriet continued to lead the LAPD with her trademark blend of firmness and empathy. Although some nights she still jerked awake, remembering the intensity of that slap and the eerie hush that followed, but she refused to let it define her. One quiet afternoon, Harriet visited the Redwood Pacific headquarters. She had been invited by CEO Caitlin Zhang to discuss improving the airline's approach to mental health support and passenger safety. Harriet agreed, seeing an opportunity to turn a traumatic incident into a catalyst for positive change. Zhang greeted her in a spacious conference room overlooking the La skyline. "We've restructured our pilot wellness program," Zhang said, handing Harriet a thick file. "Mandatory counseling sessions, monthly check-ins, robust stress management workshops. We can't let what happened with Captain Crowley happen again." Harriet thumbed through the pages, impressed by the thoroughness of the plan. "This is a step in the right direction," she said. "If it helps even one pilot avoid a meltdown, it's worth it." They shook hands, forging a cooperative effort to prevent future incidents. Harriet left Redwood Pacific that day feeling a sense of closure, that some good could arise from a terrible situation. On the drive home, Harriet reflected on her life's journey. From a child in south-central LA to chief of police, she'd faced challenges that tested every fiber of her being. This assault was another test, and she emerged stronger, more steadfast in her commitment to justice. At home, her daughter Nadia was waiting in the living room. She approached Harriet with a gentle smile and hugged her. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she whispered. Harriet squeezed her daughter, grateful for the unwavering support of her family. The next morning, Harriet donned her uniform and walked into LAPD headquarters. She was greeted by applause from some of her officers, many of whom had watched the final sentencing on live broadcasts. They admired her composure under such a shocking, personal violation. Though Harriet felt a little embarrassed by the attention, she accepted it gracefully, feeling a sense of camaraderie that ran deeper than ever. Meanwhile, in a humble jail cell, Sebastian Crowley began his journey of introspection. As part of his sentence, he attended anger management classes and met with a therapist who specialized in high-pressure professions. He found himself gradually coming to terms with the pain he had carried for years, the financial strain, the fear of failure, the bottled-up rage. It was a long road to redemption, but behind bars, away from the cockpit, Bastien finally confronted the man he'd become. Sometimes he thought about Harriet, how she looked at him in court, not with hatred, but with a kind of measured disappointment that seemed worse than any shouting. He vowed to change, even if it was too late to salvage his old life. Perhaps one day he could find a new path, something that allowed him to contribute meaningfully. In the City of Angels, life moved on. Planes continued to take off and land. The sun rose and set over the Pacific, reminding everyone that even the darkest storms yield to new dawns. Harriet's bruise faded, leaving only a faint memory of that day. But in her heart, the lesson remained. Power must be wielded responsibly, whether one wears a badge or pilots an airplane. And so it was that a single moment in the sky became a testament to the unpredictable ways fate can unite two very different lives. The pilot who lost himself in anger and the chief who refused to compromise her principles had crossed paths. In the aftermath, both found themselves irrevocably changed. Thank you for joining me on this rollercoaster journey of power, responsibility, and redemption. The story of a pilot's ill-fated choice and a resolute chief of police reveals how a single act can ripple through countless lives, carrying lessons that echo far beyond one shocking moment. From a bustling airport terminal to the hush of a courtroom, we've seen that justice and compassion can coexist, that second chances are possible, and that true leadership is tested in moments of crisis. If this story moved you or made you think about accountability and the paths we choose, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to this channel. Let's continue to explore powerful narratives together, diving deep into the human spirit, where empathy, courage, and justice light the way. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and reminds us all that we can find hope, even in our darkest hours.